Donc, ça va être une conférence en anglais. D'accord, c'est bien, ça vous entraîne, hein. Nous, on va travailler sur le plurilinguisme et le pluriculturalisme. Donc, il faut quand même se mettre à d'autres langues, sinon, c'est pas très pertinent. Et on a des gens qui sont en ligne, donc soit des étudiants dans d'autres universités, des collègues, des gens qui font des doctorats, donc ils vont venir écouter aussi. Et après, on a pas mal de sur notre chaîne YouTube L'Humain. Si vous faites YouTube L'Humain, c'est notre laboratoire de recherche. Vous avez aussi d'autres séminaires, d'autres collègues qui travaillent sur la didactique du français langue étrangère. Donc, si ça vous intéresse, vous pouvez aussi aller les écouter ou les regarder. C'est intéressant. Et voilà ce que je voulais vous dire en substance. Après, il y aura un goûter qui sera offert. C'est pour dire au revoir à nos étudiants de Master 2 et les encourager. Ils vont partir en stage. Et pour vous, on va dire pour la fin de l'année. Et puis aussi, c'est pour que vous rencontriez vos camarades. Parce que voilà, moi, je vous encourage aussi, demain, à venir en juillet écouter les soutenances des N2. C'est public, c'est libre, c'est pas pour mettre la pression à N2, mais normalement, c'est tout à fait possible, hein. Ça fait partie du droit d'aller écouter. Donc, vous pouvez venir écouter ces heures vous entraîner. Donc, n'hésitez pas à aller écouter. Voilà. Je vais demander en ligne s'ils nous entendent. Ah, non, voilà. Bonjour les collègues en ligne, est-ce que vous nous entendez bien? Est-ce que vous avez du son? Vous nous entendez très bien. Bonjour à Fanny. Je vois qu'il y a some of my PhD candidates from Paris, from west of France. So it's nice. Merci beaucoup d'être parmi nous. Je suis très contente que vous puissiez participer, même en ligne. Voilà. Ce que je vais faire, c'est que je vais vous donner. J'avais trop de faire, donc je vais faire.
Cool.
Pour votre suivi, participer à des séminaires comme ça ou à des choses qui sont un peu exceptionnelles. Hein. Peut-être que vous ne vous en rendez pas compte, mais Jeff Maxwell, c'est quelqu'un qui est trop connu dans le domaine de l'enseignement des langues aux États-Unis. Donc, vous mettez votre nom ici et vous pouvez l'ajouter à votre CV. C'est-à-dire que vous pouvez dire que vous avez suivi cette. Voilà. Vous pouvez prendre un papier et vous rajoutez le nom, garder dans votre CV. Un petit plus. Tu veux dire quelque chose, Stéphane?
Ah non, non, non.
Vas-y.
Non, c'était juste en fait pour te dire que tout va bien et que j'ai la playlist.
Ah ben parfait. And you have watchers here?
Okay.
So
Do I need the microphone?
I don't know actually. Maybe Zoom. I think online they hear very well, but
Okay.
if there's something wrong, s'il y a quelque chose qui ne va pas en ligne, vous nous le dites et on. Alors, on nous entend depuis l'Italie. Marissa Cavalli, a well-known scholar about plurilingualism in Val d'Aosta in Italy. She's here.
Great.
And she can hear very well. OK. And Brendan Gear. OK. So, je pense que tout le monde peut entendre. C'est formidable. S'il y a un problème, je gérerai. Voilà. Ah, il y a des gens from Quebec too.
Oh, sorry.
Canada, Quebec.
Who?
Québec.
Who?
Catherine Gosselin.
Okay, great.
You know her?
Yes.
OK, great. Bonjour Catherine. Voilà, on fait un peu le tour du monde aujourd'hui. Hein. D'accord. On commence ou on t'attend? OK. Alors, pour pas trop vous faire attendre en ligne et en présence, donc je vais vous présenter mon collègue Jeff Maxwell de l'Université de Maryland. Jeff Maxwell from Maryland University.
Mm-hmm.
He's a well-known scholar from the field of Codeswitching, Translanguaging, and Linguistic social justice. Is very keen on diversity. Voilà, c'est vraiment quelqu'un qui travaille sur le plurilinguisme, l'interculturel. Vous allez voir que là, ce qu'on est en train de faire, en fait, quand on va faire les cours, notamment de Master 1, c'est ce qu'on fait. Hein. On mélange les langues, pas pour mélanger et dire n'importe quoi, mais parce que ça a un sens, évidemment, de pouvoir changer de langue selon les besoins des auditeurs, évidemment, pour la compréhension. Donc voilà, donc si vous voulez lire les travaux de Jeff Maxwell, hein, you have a journal, maybe you can say something about your journal. Il a une revue sur le multilinguisme, il a publié de multiples travaux et livres sur ces questions-là, évidemment sur le contexte américain, mais nous on parlera du contexte français. Et c'est intéressant de voir comment ils font aussi aux États-Unis avec ces questions de langue. Donc, many thanks again, Jeff, to be here. And je te laisse te présenter. I'll leave you the floor. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to all of you for coming. So I'm going to be talking about varieties of translanguaging, and you'll see more specifically why I emphasize varieties as we go, and also code switching and issues around linguistic social justice. And so can I just ask you, how many of you know a little bit about code switching? Few. How many know a little bit about translanguaging?
Vous êtes tous obligés, en tout cas,
Okay.
les N2, Master degree, 7 years. You should
Okay.
raise your hand.
Okay. Okay. Very good. So I asked that just to know a little bit more about the audience. And if it's okay, I'm going to sit down just because it's easier to page through and see my slides. So there we go. So a lot of terms have been introduced recently for multilingualism. You see some of these terms on the slide there. Many of them, some of them, maybe a couple of them are familiar to you. There was a recent time in the history of applied linguistics when, you know, everybody wanted to introduce a new term for multilingualism.
Sorry, Jeff. I think the slideshow is stuck. Verity in the, yes, we can see it, but online. I see it is the first slide, so maybe.
Oh. That's the first slide, and then it doesn't change online.
You know, on the mode, but you can see the slides. It is the plan of the slideshow.
Okay, let's see. Oh, do you think?
That's strange. Yeah, you see what I see from the
Right.
Zoom.
I think, Are you looking through Zoom?
Yes. And yeah, Catherine and Fanny said.
They said the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, let me check.
Ne vous inquiétez pas. Voilà, ça permet aux retardataires d'arriver tranquillement. Tu sais comment faire? C'est parce qu'en fait, en ligne, ils ne voient pas le diaporama de défilé.
You should share your screen and share sound as well.
Okay.
But the entire screen, you know?
Right. So
Not only the.
What do you mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
You should stop share over here. Share your screen, the entire screen, and the sound.
Okay.
That's okay. And then you have floating meeting controls over here.
Okay, and should, oh, okay,
It's okay now.
it's good
can
now.
see.
Okay, great.
Again.
Okay, no worries. And I guess people can hear me online just fine? Okay,
Yes.
very good. All right. So now it advanced, correct? Yeah. Okay. So as I was saying, a lot of different terms have been introduced for multilingualism. The classic one that people have used for language switching is code switching. And so I'll come back and say a little more about that. Translanguaging has at least two components that can and should be distinguished. pedagogical translanguaging, and theoretical translanguaging. Pedagogical translanguaging are those aspects of translanguaging that really relate to bilingual teaching. So those are applied educational issues around translanguaging. And then there's a body of work focused on translanguaging theory. What does translanguaging or within a translanguaging framework, how should we understand the nature of bilingualism, the nature of linguistic diversity? And there are actually two historical waves in translanguaging. The first one I'll call early translanguaging theory, and that was promoted in a book by Ofelia Garcia in 2009 that accepted multilingualism as psychologically real and socially significant. So there are actual bilinguals and multilinguals in the world, and we sometimes call this a multilingual perspective on translanguaging. And then around 2015, we saw the emergence of late translanguaging theory that adopted a view promoted by Alistair Pennycook that he identified as a postmodernist and post-colonial approach to language policy. And this approach rejected the idea that there are named languages and also rejected the very idea of multilingualism, because if you don't have different languages, you can't be multilingual. And this view is sometimes called deconstructivism. Okay, so I just want to document a little bit for you the evolution here. So in Garcia's early work, she talked about code switching in a positive light. She talked about it in a pedagogical context. She talked about it in a sociolinguistic context, never with any reluctance or criticism. And then, well, actually, you see there a concrete example of this characterizing code switching. Code switching often occurs spontaneously among bilingual speakers in communication with others who share their knowledge, who share their languages. Far from being a sign of inadequacy or sloppy language usage or lack of knowledge, it has been shown that code switching is a sophisticated linguistic skill and a characteristic of speech of fluent bilinguals. Here's another description within this early perspective of code switching in a paper by Garcia, Flores, and Woodley, where they describe code switching again in a positive way, although many language scholars have argued that these everyday language practices of bilinguals are normative and intelligent expressions of bilingualism. These practices have been racialized and stigmatized as corrupted language or Spanglish. And there you see quotations of Poplack, Centella, and Max Swan. Okay, so then in 2015, people in translanguaging, I think, got tired of being asked an annoying question, which was, how is translanguaging different from code switching? And they had historically struggled to answer that question. In the early work, translanguaging was sort of an umbrella concept that included code switching, borrowing, other dimensions of language contact. But then it began, so then there was an interest in differentiating code switching from translanguaging to find sort of a unique way of characterizing translanguaging. And in the background to this, Alistair Pennycook had been talking about his special approach to multilingualism, a postmodern, a post-colonial approach to language policy suggests we no longer need to maintain the pernicious myth that languages exist. So for Pennycook, he saw languages as an artifact of colonialism. Colonists came to different places and named languages with different names. And by using those names, we reify and reinforce colonialism. And so he was suggesting that we forget about named languages and just respect people as individual language users. And so here's a further expression of that view. The view of languages we are suggesting here has serious implications for many of the treasured icons of liberal linguistic thought. Not only do the notions of language become highly suspect, but so do many related concepts that are premised on a notion of discrete languages, such as language rights, mother tongues, multilingualism, or code switching. So if there's no multilingualism, there's no such thing as language switching. If there are no linguistic communities, no discrete languages, then we can't talk about language rights. We can't talk about mother tongues. So he's acknowledging that there are widespread consequences of throwing out the idea of named languages. So this idea was picked up in Otegi Garcia and Reed in 2015 in a paper that was specifically focused as a critique of code switching. And they wanted then to characterize code switching in a negative way, in a critical way, to differentiate it and distance it from translanguaging, which they argued was a superior perspective. Code switching constitutes a theoretical endorsement of the idea that what the bilingual manipulates are two separate linguistic systems. And they wanted to say, no, there are no separate linguistic systems. That's a problem. Okay, so now I want to rewind a little bit and look a bit at the history of code switching, which is coming up from behind. Originally in the 1960s and prior to that, we had what we can think of as tacit theories or assumptions about code switching. These are ideologies that people possess without really thinking seriously through them. So just as with stigmatized varieties of English and stigmatized varieties of French or any language, code switching was very poorly understood, even among academics at the time. And so here I give you a couple examples of that. Rebel Heyman, who did research on German English bilingualism, criticized the morphologically and lexically garbled language of many half-educated German immigrants. So very negative views about mixing languages. And also Jim Cummins, who in other contexts has done positive work, especially around the idea of translanguaging, in his early work in the 1970s, also endorsed this idea of semilingualism as evidencing itself in the manner of code switching. So he says semilingual children may switch codes because they do not know either language. So this was not the perspective of people who actually studied code switching. And so we saw a empirically informed and theoretically rigorous body of work begin to emerge around code switching. And here you have a quote from a scholar named John Lipsky, who was an early code switching researcher. He's still active, still writing. And in 2014, he was writing a sort of short history of the field. And he has this characterization of the purpose and value of code switching work. He says, seeking to dispel popular notions that equate code switching with confusion, alingualism, imperfect acquisition, or just plain laziness, linguists have, since the early 1970s, devoted considerable effort to demonstrating grammatical and pragmatic conditions favoring or constraining code switching. Bilingual code switching, so analyzed, is not regarded as a deficiency or anomaly. So, in this historical context, linguists were interested in minoritized language varieties in the US and in other parts of the world. John Gumpers, who was an early researcher focused on code switching, did his early work focused on dialect switching in Norway. And scholars in the US context were concerned about issues of social justice. And so there was lots of effort to study and understand African American language, which had been characterized in very derisive terms, and work by Bill Above and many others, prominent sociolinguists, showed that African American language was just as structured, rule governed, and principled as the dominant variety of English. And so folks who were working on code switching or language mixing had the same idea in mind. Let's study bilingual language mixing and see if there's an underlying system. And if there is an underlying system, then that gives evidence that it is structured and rule governed and therefore principled in exactly the same way as monolingual language. So we had this early, so we had this early work then. Here's a couple of examples of code switching that come from a paper by Gumpers and Hernandez Chavez, published in 1970. They observed what they called linguistic constraints on code switching. And here you see code switching between Spanish and English. In the first case, there's a switch between a subject pronoun and the predicate, and that has a star next to it, which means it's ill-formed. And ill-formed, in case you don't know, means that there's a psychological intuition that people have, according to which that sentence is not possible. You would not say that in any context. The second one is not ill-formed. It's fine. You can easily imagine a context in which you would say that. And these are the intuitions of Spanish-English bilinguals who practice code switching routinely. So the first one, he era regador, ill-formed. The second one, era regador at one time, mixing English and Spanish. That's perfectly fine. So just to bring this point home about grammaticality intuitions, because it's important for linguistic theory, here you see an example, two examples, example A, example B. In example A, you see John saw the red barn, perfectly fine, natural. John painted the barn red, perfectly fine, but we would never say in English, John saw the barn red. Something hits us. No, that's not right. And you could do this in French, you could do this in Italian. Any language on earth has these underlying grammaticality intuitions. And these intuitions drive the formation of grammatical theory. It's based on these grammaticality intuitions that we develop theories about what is in our subconscious heads, what is in our minds subconsciously about the underlying structure of language. Here's another example. John likes himself, perfectly fine, but not John thinks that I like himself. So linguists develop theories about English, about French, about any language you can imagine that maps the underlying grammatical system that is responsible ultimately for these grammaticality intuitions. Okay, so just like in monolingual language, we have these intuitions in bilingual code switching. So one of the strongest restrictions Again, switching applies to the switching between subject pronouns and the finite verb. So here are some examples. This is from a paper I did with Ellie Van Gelderen. Between Spanish and English, you'll fight all the time. We collected data from a group of Spanish, English, bilingual young people. They said, no, that's ill-formed. Any similar example, ellos fight all the time, ellas, ella, those are all ill-formed, but mi novia fights all the time, where you have a lexical subject, that's fine. Mis amigos fight all the time, that's fine. So what I want to do just briefly is illustrate for you how linguists came up with theories about code switching, right? Sort of how the process of theory construction works. So we start by reflecting on how we would account for these grammaticality effects and think about independently motivated theories that we could bring to bear to explain the effects we see. And so independently in the syntactic literature, we know from that literature, we know that pronouns are individual words. They're sort of bundles of features and what we call syntactic heads. And lexical subjects are phrases. They have articles in front of them and similar kinds of indicators of that. And so structurally, they're a little bit different. And so there's a process known as feature checking in the theory of syntax. And again, this is a little bit technical. I don't want you to, I'm not trying to get you to understand all of these details. I'm just trying to illustrate the kind of work that goes into this enterprise. And so drawing on syntactic theory, we know that lexical subjects check features differently from lexical heads. And so here's an example of that. Lexical subject moves from a lower position in the syntactic tree to a higher position and checks its features in what we call the specifier position of the highest phrase, which is TP. But the pronoun checks its features lower and it moves as a head. And so as a result, it's forming a unit with other heads, which is a kind of compounding. So even though we don't see it orthographically, there's a kind of compounding going on between the subject, the pronominal subject, and the verb. So interesting. Let's explore that further to see if there's something about this compounding that might result in these grammaticality effects. So let's look at similar kind of phenomena. Well, it turns out that you also can't code switch inside a word. So here's an example, perfectly fine, English, Spanish, flipeando. So there, this English stem flip is fully phonologically accommodated to Spanish. So when we add the affix, it's perfectly fine. But if we take an affix that is not, if we take a stem that is not phonologically possible in Spanish and add an affix, now it's judged by bilingual code switchers to be ill-formed, runyeando, ill-formed. And so the observation is that code switching word internally is ill-formed. And also if you try to code switch between Spanish and English, between these sort of word-like elements called clitics and verbs, it's also ill-formed. And that's because clitics also form a unit with the adjacent verb. So we have Spanish, yo la vi, which means I saw her. And if we try to code switch between saw as the verb and the clitic la as the object, it's ill-formed, yo la saw. So we come up with this generalization that tells us there's something about being ahead and merging with the element next to you, that results in an ill-formed condition. So that makes a prediction about the data we showed earlier, where we had ill-formed conditions, ill-formed results associated with switching between a subject pronoun and a verb, and it was perfectly fine when we switched between a phrase, a lexical subject, and a verb. So can we test this idea further by using what we call the test of conjunction? So something interesting about conjunction in syntactic theory is that you can only conjoin two elements that are of the same category. So you can conjoin two phrases, like using and, or you can conjoin two heads using and. And a pronoun as a head can be dominated by a phrase. So if we conjoin a pronoun and a lexical subject, then it has to be a phrase. So the prediction would be, if we conjoin a lexical subject with a pronoun and then code switch, it should be fine, because we said the problem was the subject pronoun moves as a head. But if it's conjoined, then it has to move farther up as a phrase. And there, I'm not going to go over those, but those examples you see there are just intended to demonstrate that you can only conjoin things that are of the same category. Okay, so let's see if this prediction bears out. Mis amigos y yo fight all the time. That's fine now. Yo y mis amigos fight all the time. Mis amigos y él, mis amigos y ellos. In the paper that I wrote with Ellie Van Gelderen, our focus group of Spanish-English bilinguals told us these are all fine now. So it's really surprising because, for example, in the first one, you have the subject pronoun exactly next to the verb, just like you did in the case where the subject pronoun stands alone, but now it's ill-formed. So this corroborates our theory about why the structure is ill-formed. So again, a lot of technical detail in there, which I'm only sharing to show you that there's a lot of focused, detailed, and robust energy that goes into the analysis of bilingual code switching, which results in a theory about bilingual grammar. So I showed you one little slice of data from one paper that I did with Ellie Van Gelderen in 2008, but there's a lot of work on code switching. And here in this slide, I'm showing you sort of the evolution of the field from the 1970s with representative publications, different waves of theoretical development that have taken place over time. There's a parallel body of work on code switching and language use that's focused on the conversational contribution of code switching. That was the focus of John Gumper's earlier work that I mentioned to you. And here what we observe in this important body of work is, questions about why are people motivated to code switch rather than the grammatical structure. So this work is complementary. It's not like a different point of view. It's just a different topic within the general field of code switching. And so again, lots of work done in that domain of work too. So the grammatical work on code switching leads us to a concept of bilingual grammar that could be represented this way, and I call this an integrated model of multilingualism. And there are many different theories about bilingual code switching and bilingual grammar, and they all converge on this picture in one way or another. And the idea is that bilinguals have certain components of their grammar that are shared and certain components of their grammar that are discrete or separate, because there are contradictory rules across different languages, and those rules that are contradictory have to be sort of protected and isolated from one another. And I love this quote by Chomsky, which shows that, so the second bullet, every person is multilingual in a more technical sense. So more broadly, as Jim Gies says, we all speak social languages, different social languages in different contexts. So the way you speak to a close friend is probably different from the way you speak to your professor, and so on and so forth. So these different social languages often have grammatical reflexes as well. So it's not just multilinguals who are constantly switching, but also so-called monolinguals. Okay, so that's the story of code switching. And so now I want to get back to deconstructivism. So as I said, early translanguaging was this umbrella term that included and appreciated all the work that had taken place in code switching scholarship and the many other dimensions of research on bilingualism that had been done by psychologists and linguists and many others. But even though code switching was the focus of this critique, deconstructivism has much wider implications. So the idea is that there is no internal representation of multilingualism, and this contrasts with what we know from empirical research on code switching and on bilingual grammar. So deconstructivism rejects any implication that a bilingual is internally diverse in a structured way, and advocates that every individual has an idiolect that doesn't really correspond to a linguistic community. So this means that there's no such thing as L1 and L2. There's no such thing as bilingualism at the individual level. There's no such thing as heritage language, and so on. So the consequences are quite extensive. In a paper by Garcia and Otegi in 2020, they say that a bilingual's language competence is always and at every stage complete. So that idea of sort of very strict individualism in evaluating language proficiency has deep consequences for language learning. Okay, it means that my French is just as good as your French, and I don't speak French really at all. Right? I know words like croissant that were borrowed into English, if you want to even consider that French, but I am always and at every stage complete in my knowledge of French, just like you. So that makes it quite challenging to evaluate language learning over a trajectory of levels. So ideas like dual language, first language, second language, learning and acquisition, language mixing, heritage language, they all go out the window if we accept this premise of deconstructivism. So this team of scholars who sort of ganged up on code switching wrote 4 papers to date. Actually, I think there have been a couple more recently that really specifically go after code switching as a sort of enemy of late translanguaging theory, and I've listed those papers there. So the way work is done in this field and in linguistic theory in general is, if you want to advance a competing theory, you present a theory that is sufficiently detailed as to be evaluated by empirical evidence, and you present empirical evidence that shows the competing theory is wrong. That's all fair game, perfectly legitimate, happens all the time. But what has happened in this work is there is no theory at all that has been presented in any of these papers. They're just all vague metaphors about what's in the head of bilinguals. There's no empirical evidence, nothing whatsoever. They don't even cite the code switching literature or research on bilingual grammar. It's all just pure conjecture. There's no actual theory, no review of prior research, and no data. And you know, as students, that any paper you wrote that had those characteristics would be immediately rejected by your professor. But theirs was accepted for publication in a journal that was edited by one of their frequent co-authors, Li Wei. So when you think more broadly about the empirical problems that they're confronted with, they're quite massive. And so this sort of vague idea that they present that there's no internal organization of bilingualism is very challenging for questions related to phonological restrictions, morphological restrictions, and syntactic restrictions that are manifested in the study of bilingual code switching. And studying these properties of bilingual language tell us about the organization of bilingual language use and bilingual grammar. They shouldn't in any way be threatening. In fact, the idea that there's no internal structure whatsoever ought to be threatening, and it has historically been viewed as a critical threat and one of the key motivations for the original work in code switching. So I'm not going to go over this list, but I just want to sort of present it to you broadly. Okay, so I'm not the only one who has these concerns. Here in this slide, I've got two critical remarks by some prominent scholars, but there are many, many similar remarks that I could share with you by others. Stephen May, who works on language policy, which is Pennycook's field, he criticizes recent developments in translanguaging theory, which present what he calls a high degree of historical amnesia, or at least historical ellipsis. We see this clearly in the progression of translanguaging as a new academic paradigm via its increasing dichotomization of translanguaging and code switching. And I love this quote by Peter Auer, who's known for being very frank and very candid. He is the leading scholar focused on code switching and language use. That slide I put up earlier. His focus is on conversational analysis and code switching. Peter says, the construction of translanguaging as a counter notion to code switching is based on a gross misrepresentation of research on bilingualism and code switching as it has accumulated since the 1970s. Okay, so I have more to say, but I want to just sort of pause here and make some preliminary conclusions. So the pedagogical aspects of translanguaging are worth taking seriously and reflecting on. They relate to questions about how we can use a child's full linguistic repertoires to teach them more effectively in school. But this later development in the theoretical dimension, which was really just motivated by an interest in distancing code switching from translanguaging, is based on complete conjecture and has no basis whatsoever in linguistic theory or the empirical sciences. It emerges out of this sort of, postmodernist meandering that we find in Pennycook's work. So we conclude in favor of a multilingual perspective on translanguaging that affirms that bilingualism is socially meaningful, so named language communities, and has psychological reality, there is actual cognitive representation of bilingualism. Okay. So pedagogical implications. So we've been talking about this quite a bit earlier today and yesterday. There's really nice work, and I'll tell you more about this in a moment, by Senos and Gorder around what they call pedagogical translanguaging. And they use that phrase to sort of isolate these pedagogical features of translanguaging and separate the more recently developed negative theoretical elements that assert that there are no languages at all. And they develop a nice theoretical and practical discussion of how we can use the full linguistic repertoires of bilingual children effectively in order to teach in school. So this idea of pedagogical translanguaging keeps all of these concepts that are important to us intact. Okay, so why is this so important? So true, code switching scholars are sort of personally offended that their work has been mischaracterized and kind of demonized and so on. And it's offensive to science as an enterprise to have this kind of critique go forward. But it's also very, very important for reasons of linguistic social justice. If we don't have a concept of linguistic diversity, then we lose many, many valuable things for linguistic social justice. And so there are two levels at which we can think about linguistic diversity or bilingualism, a societal level and an individual level. So reflecting for a moment on the societal level and the idea of named languages, we run into deep problems if we no longer have a concept of linguistic varieties or languages. So I like to illustrate this in a couple of ways. So one is with the work of John Baugh on linguistic profiling. And John Baugh is a scholar who works on African American language. He got his first job at Stanford University, and he showed up. And as you would do when you arrive in a new place for a new job, he went looking for an apartment to live in, and he called ads for apartments. And he was told enthusiastically, "Oh, sure, you're a new Stanford professor. We'd love to hire you. Please come down to see the apartment." And John shows up, this big, black, young man. And guess what? Sorry, we just rented that apartment. It's not available anymore. So this happened again and again. And he started to think, well, there's something going on here, right? So eventually he found a place to live, okay? But more importantly, he started doing some very critically important linguistic research around linguistic profiling. So he studied with some collaborators what they called the phonetic correlates of linguistic discrimination. And so so in the experiment that they did, they called housing ads repeatedly, the same ones, using three different voices, three different accents. One, African American English, Chicano English, which is the variety of English spoken by many Latinos in the United States, and whatever you want to call it, dominant English, mainstream English, professional English. And so the pattern was clear. It was the apartments were always available for the person speaking professional English. And for the speakers of Chicano and Black English, sorry, the apartment was not available. in many, many cases. So this work started created a seismic shift in housing discrimination law and motivated legislation enacted at the federal level in the United States, protecting people's access to housing and fair housing. And John has testified about linguistic discrimination and linguistic profiling in many court cases brought against landlords and others for using language as a proxy for racism. So if you think about it, if we were just if these individual speakers were just individual speakers and not reflecting a community, there would be no argument for using accent as a proxy for racism, right? Because it's only by virtue of their association with a particular speech community, which in turn is associated with a race, that allows an argument for racial discrimination based on access to move forward. So this idea that there are no linguistic communities would immediately crush this idea around linguistic profiling. Another example has to do with indigenous language revitalization. So there's a wonderful paper by Nicholas and McCarty, 2022, where they discuss this in more detail. And their focus is on the indigenous language of Hopi, which is spoken in the state of Arizona in the United States. And Hopi was severely reduced in terms of numbers of speakers, and there have been efforts to revitalize it. And they make the case in this wonderful paper that naming Hopi is an act of decolonization, right? So it's important to understand that, sure, language naming can be used as an act of colonization, but language naming can also be used as an act of decolonization. So naming an indigenous language that was almost rendered extinct through oppressive practices in order to revitalize it is an act of decolonization. And without being able to name the language, you have no hope of revitalizing it, and you have no hope of redeeming it. Jasoni Senos, who did the book on pedagogical translanguaging, did a wonderful keynote on this at a recent conference in Spain with relation to Basque language, making the point that we absolutely need to be able to refer to Basque as a minoritized language in order to keep it alive and revitalize it. Other examples can be given, but I want to just briefly turn to the idea of individual bilingualism, where we also see really important problems associated with this idea as it relates to individual bilingualism and the protection of children's civil rights. So in the United States, when children arrive at school, no matter who they are, where they come from, they have to take what's called a home language survey. And as part of that home language survey, they're asked, as part of the enrollment process, they're asked, is a language other than English spoken at home? And if they answer yes to that question, then those children are considered for language assistance services that would at the very least teach them English, because if they don't know English, then they don't have any hope of understanding the language of instruction, and they are effectively excluded from school. This was brought to light in an important U.S. Supreme Court case in 1974 that stipulates that if kids come to school and don't know the language of instruction, the schools have to do something about that, And in particular, they have to teach them English. And then, of course, it takes a while to learn any language. And so they have to periodically assess the children's linguistic development and continue to protect their civil rights and access to meaningful instruction as long as it's necessary. Well, if we don't have any way of characterizing language learning, if we don't have any way of characterizing language development, then we can't protect children's civil rights, right? Because as soon as you assess a person's language, you're doing that in relation to some target, some community of speakers. And so if there's no correspondence between individual speakers of idiolects, if an individual's language ability is always and in every stage complete, then there's no such thing as language learning and language development. So that's a critically important dimension that's a critically important consequence of deconstructivism that we have to be concerned about. So as I mentioned before, there's also no such thing as an emergent bilingual, multilingual learner. All of this stuff goes out the window. Okay, and then just kind of wrapping up, I want to just give this quote from Philipson and Skutnab-Kangas, who also work in the area of language policy, just like Alistair Pennycook. They say some scholars working in the area of language policy with postmodernist leanings have challenged even the basic concept of language, whereas in national and international law, the concept is self-evident and problem-free. The challenge this presents for advocacy is obvious. In legal documents on language rights, these rights cannot be attached to non-existent entities. Okay, I've been talking too long, so I'm going to kind of skip a little bit. I just want to refer you to some additional reading if you're interested. This is a book I did with my friend and colleague Chris Faltis in 2020, Codeswitching in the Classroom, Critical Perspectives on Teaching, Learning, Policy, and Ideology. This book includes a lot of rich contributions around codeswitching and translanguaging. And it's kind of practical, but also primarily theoretical around teaching and education. And then this is a book I did more recently in 2024, Multilingual Perspectives on Translanguaging. It includes contributions from the scholars you see listed there, prominent scholars in the field of bilingualism, and its focus is really on the broader scientific context of the general assertions of deconstructivism, and it counters the idea that there are no languages and that bilingualism does not exist. And then this is the book that I mentioned earlier by Senos and Gorder, Pedagogical Translanguaging. It's available online, open access, so you can get to it and read it. It's a very nice book. And again, it is developed in the context of focusing on pedagogical aspects of translanguaging and sort of bracketing off the deconstructivist tenets of translanguaging. And Jasoni Senos has become even more sort of open in a critique of translanguaging in more recent work, and in our keynote that I mentioned in Spain, and in a forthcoming article. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.